The year was 1874, and winter had fastened its teeth deep into the Wyoming Territory. On the high plateau just south of Sagebrush Crossing, the world had been bleached of all color, reduced to a stark canvas of white snow and black rock. It was not yet dawn, perhaps 4 or 5 in the morning, but the darkness was thinning to the color of a fresh bruise, a weak, violet-gray light that promised no warmth. A north wind, born in the high peaks, screamed across the frozen expanse. It carried no mercy, only the sharp, granular sting of ice. It howled through the skeletal branches of the lodgepole pines, making them bow and scrape like penitents. The snow, fine as milled flour, didn't fall. It flew sideways, clawing at the split-rail fence that marked the edge of Colt Merritt's property. In the distance, the call of a raven cut the air, a single, flat note of hunger against the massive, empty sky. The loneliness here was a physical thing, an atmosphere as thick and suffocating as smoke. Colt Merritt felt the cold before he saw it. He pushed the heavy plank door of his cabin open, the oiled leather hinges groaning in protest. The air that rushed in was a physical assault, a slap that stole the breath and burned the lungs. He paused for a moment on the threshold. A man carved from the same hard materials as the land itself. He was wide in the shoulder, his frame carrying the memory of strength. Though he had let himself go lean, his face, weathered and hard, was framed by a dark beard, now stiff with frost just from standing in the doorway. His eyes, the color of winter steel, were accustomed to scanning vast, empty distances. He had been a scout during the war, a man paid to see what others missed, to read the story left in a bent blade of grass or a disturbed stone. Now, he was just a man with a small string of horses, a recluse hiding from a world that had taken too much. He pulled the sheepskin collar of his coat tighter around his neck and stepped out onto the porch. He moved down the narrow, packed-down path toward the barn, his boots crunching on the icy crust. The path was treacherous, a slick ribbon of white. But his feet knew the way by heart. His body moved, but his mind remained where it always was, locked in the unyielding quiet of his self-imposed exile. His thoughts were occupied by the twin ghosts of silence and memory, and always the memory of Eleanor. Her name was a constant, dull ache just beneath his ribs, a missing piece of his own skeleton. He remembered the sound of her laugh, a thing that had seemed too warm for this high, cold country. He remembered the way she could gentle the wildest colt with just a word and a touch. He had buried her 2 years prior, and with her, he had buried the man he used to be. He reached the low-slung barn, a structure built of rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud. He pulled back the heavy wooden bar that secured the sliding door. The door rumbled open, revealing a wall of deeper darkness within. The familiar scent of the barn rushed out to meet the Arctic air, the sweet, dusty smell of cured hay, the earthy tang of damp straw, the warmth of equine bodies, and the sharp, comforting smell of old leather. It was the only comfort he allowed himself most days. His black stallion, a powerful beast he called Hades, shifted in the first stall, letting out a low, vibrating nicker. But the sound was wrong. It wasn't the stallion's usual confident greeting. It was a nervous sound, a question. Colt's body tensed instantly. The years of civilian life, such as they were, evaporated. The scout, the soldier, took over. He did not move. He stood perfectly still in the doorway, a silhouette against the gray morning, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper black inside the barn. The horses in the far stalls were restless, stamping their hooves, their breath pluming in the cold. And then he saw it. It was not just a shadow cast by a saddle rack. In the first stall, nestled deep in the straw directly against the massive, warm flank of Hades, there was a shape. It was huddled beneath his best saddle blanket, a dark mass curled as small as a hunted animal trying to absorb the last bit of life from the beast beside it, a human shape. His hand did not move quickly. It moved with a lethal, practiced economy, dropping to the worn wooden grip of the Colt Navy revolver holstered on his hip. His fingers found their familiar place, the cold metal a sudden, terrible comfort. He did not draw, not yet. He stepped inside the barn, his movements utterly fluid, his boots making no sound on the straw-covered floor. His gray eyes, now sharp and missing nothing, scanned the darkness. The barn was still, save for the nervous shifting of the horses. The only other sound was the relentless shriek of the wind, a high-pitched wail that seemed to wrap around the building, testing the walls. He moved closer to the first stall. The figure did not stir. He listened, his head tilted. He heard the deep, steady huff of the stallion, and beneath it, another sound, so faint it was almost imperceptible, a shallow, ragged breath, the breathing of the intruder. He stopped just outside the stall. Hades watched him, the whites of his eyes gleaming in the gloom. The shape was small, a woman. He could tell that even in the dim light, her hair was matted and dark, fanned out over the edge of the blanket. She was painfully thin. The blanket failed to hide the skeletal sharpness of her form. Her clothes, what he could see of them, were more rags than garments. The hem of a dark wool skirt frozen stiff with mud and ice. His eyes traveled down. Her feet, they were not in boots. They were wrapped in scraps of burlap, tied with fraying twine. Dark, ugly stains had soaked through the rough fabric. One of her hands, purpled and raw with frostbite, was visible. Clutching the leather skirt of his saddle blanket, she held it not for warmth, but as a lifeline, as if it were the only thing keeping her from drifting away into the frozen dark. Pity was a feeling Colt mistrusted. It was a weakness, an open door for the world to get its hooks back into you. But this was a different kind of misery. This was the end of a rope. He knelt slowly, his knees cracking in the cold. Was she dead, or close to it? He reached out a hand, rough and calloused from work and weather, intending to shake her shoulder. He just wanted her out. He wanted to deal with this, to eject this piece of human suffering from his sanctuary, to be alone again. His fingers were inches from the thin, blanket-covered shoulder when her lips moved. They were cracked, bleeding, almost blue in the cold. A sound escaped. Not a word, but a breath of air shaped by a thought. It was a sigh. Then it came again, weak but terrifyingly clear. A whisper that cut through the silence of the barn and the howl of the wind. A sound that seemed to pass through his coat and his ribs and stop his heart cold. Eleanor, I'm sorry. The name. Her name. The name that was never, ever spoken aloud in this place. Colt Merritt's body went rigid. His hand stopped, suspended in the air just above her. It was as if the word itself had turned the air to solid ice, trapping him within it. Eleanor. It was a name that belonged to the sun, to wildflowers on the high prairie, to the scent of baking bread in a cabin that now felt hollow. It was a name he hadn't heard spoken by another human being in nearly 2 years, not since the day he had stood alone on the bluff, the wind tearing at his hair, and watched the last shovelful of dirt cover her coffin. The years of carefully constructed solitude, the thick walls of grief and silence he had built around himself, did not just crack, they shattered. A cold that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter flooded his veins. 1,000 questions, sharp as bullets, ripped through his mind. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? And the only question that mattered, the one that screamed in the sudden, roaring silence of his head, how in God's name did a half-frozen widow, dying in his barn, know his dead wife's name? Perhaps it was the intensity of his stare, the sudden, violent shift in the air. The woman's eyes snapped open. They were wide, frantic, the color of whiskey in the dim light. For a second, they were unfocused, seeing only the ghosts of her own nightmare. Then they focused on him. She saw a large man, a wall of shadow looming over her. She saw the rough-hewn angular face, the unkempt beard silvered with frost, and the eyes. She saw the steel-gray eyes, flat and cold, and holding a world of danger. A raw sound of terror ripped from her throat. She didn't scream, it was a gasp, a desperate, hopeless intake of air. She scrambled backward, crab-walking through the straw, trying to push herself away from him with her heels. Her movements were clumsy, panicked. Her eyes darted around the stall. looking for a weapon, for an escape. Her hand hit something hard, a broken rake handle, the tines long since snapped off, left in the corner of the stall. She seized it, her raw fingers fumbling for a grip. She lifted it, a pathetic, useless defense, her entire body shaking so violently the wooden handle rattled against the stall boards. Colt did not move. He didn't rise. He remained crouched, a predator perfectly at ease. Watching her, he slowly, deliberately, lifted his left hand, palm open and out, a gesture meant to calm a spooked horse, not a terrified woman. His other hand remained near his sidearm. The wind howled, rattling the barn door in its frame. The stallion, Hades, stamped nervously, rattling his halter. When Colt spoke, his voice was not the shout she must have expected. It was worse. It was quiet, a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried above the wind, yet it cut through her panic like a honed blade. It was a voice that held no warmth, no pity, no quarter, only a chilling, absolute demand for the truth. "I'll ask you one thing," he said, his steel-gray eyes locked on hers, pinning her against the wall. "And I want an answer." He leaned forward, just an inch, the dim light catching the frost in his beard and the lethal calm in his gaze. "Why do you know my wife's name?" He did not offer a hand. He seized her by the thin fabric covering her upper arm, his fingers digging in like talons, and hauled her to her feet. The broken rake handle clattered uselessly into the straw. She was impossibly light, a thing of bundled rags and fragile bones. And she cried out, a thin bird-like sound of pain and fear. He ignored it. He half-dragged, half-marched her from the relative warmth of the barn out into the pre-dawn fury of the storm. The wind hit them like a solid wall, stealing her breath and making her stumble on the icy path. He did not slow his pace, his grip a merciless vice on her arm, pulling her along in his wake as he moved toward the cabin. She was a contamination, a piece of a nightmare that had just crossed the threshold from his memory into his reality, and he wanted her contained. He shoved her through the cabin door, the force of it sending her stumbling forward to her knees on the rough-hewn floorboards. He slammed the door shut, the heavy wood booming, and for a moment, the only sound was the high-pitched scream of the wind trying to get back in. The cabin was a single, large room, as sparse and hard as the man who lived in it. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, the blankets folded with military precision. A cast-iron stove stood cold in the corner. In the center, a wide stone fireplace dominated the room, its hearth filled with a bed of deep, glowing red embers that pulsed with heat. A simple table and two straight-backed chairs sat near it. "Get up," Colt commanded, his voice flat. "By the fire!" She scrambled to obey, her frozen, burlap-wrapped feet slipping on the wood. She almost fell again, catching herself on the back of one of the chairs, and then practically crawled to the stone hearth, collapsing onto the worn bearskin rug in front of it. She held her purpled, shaking hands out to the radiant heat, a ragged sob of relief and pain catching in her throat. Colt watched her, his face grim. He moved to the table, his movements economical. He unholstered the Colt Navy and laid it on the scarred wood, placing it with deliberate care. It was not pointed at her, but it was there, between them, a silent third party in the conversation. It was within his reach and far from hers. He remained standing, a towering dark silhouette against the room's dim light, his presence dominating the small space. He tossed another log onto the embers. A shower of sparks erupted, hissing up the chimney, and the flames caught, licking at the new wood. The sudden, bright light illuminated her face, and for the first time, he truly saw her. She was young, perhaps barely 20, but it was a hard-worn youth. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp and prominent under skin stretched taut and pale. Her dark hair was a matted tangle, plastered to her skull with melted snow and something that looked like mud. And there were scars. They were not the fresh marks of her journey, but older, paler lines, a thin, white crescent just below her left eyebrow, a small, puckered mark on her chin. They were faint, like stories written in ink that had faded, but stories he recognized. They were the marks of a life that had been anything but kind. The warmth began to thaw her, and with it came the pain. She was shaking violently, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear them click. "My name," she began, her voice a reedy whisper, "is Rowan Pierce. I'm a widow. My husband, he died. Up at Copper Willow Basin. There was a fight over cards." Colt's expression did not change. He made no move, offered no word of sympathy. He simply waited, his silence as heavy and cold as a burial stone. "I didn't ask your name," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And I didn't ask about your husband. You're here for one reason." He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table, the new firelight casting harsh shadows across his face. "You said her name." Rowan flinched. She pulled her hands back from the fire and wrapped them around herself, as if to hold her own broken pieces together. She was terrified, but beneath the terror, something else was surfacing. A grim, exhausted resolve. The look of someone who had carried a poison for too long and was now desperate to be rid of it, no matter the cost. "I did," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the fire, "because I've heard it, over and over, for days." She swallowed, the sound painful and dry. "My husband, his name was Silas Pierce. He wasn't a good man. He was a gambler, and sometimes he was a gun for hire. When the cards were cold," she paused, gathering the strength to say the next part, "he took a bullet in a saloon. It went bad. It was in his gut. The doc said he wouldn't last the night, but he lasted 2 days. And he talked. Oh, God, how he talked. The fever, it burned the lies out of him. He kept saying Eleanor," Rowan choked out, the word tearing from her throat. "He kept saying, 'I'm sorry, Eleanor.'" Colt's stillness was absolute. He had become a statue of vengeance, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. He said he'd been working for a man, a big man, a railroad man. Bartholomew Pike. The name hit the small cabin with the force of a physical blow. Colt's head snapped up. His eyes, which had been fixed on the table, now locked onto her. Bartholomew Pike, the benefactor of Sagebrush Crossing. The man who had come to this valley 2 years ago with promises of prosperity and steel rails. The man who had offered to buy Colt's land and Eleanor's land. The man they had refused. "Go on," Colt said, and the 2 words were more dangerous than any shout. Silas said Pike hired him and his partner for a job here, on this plateau. Rowan's voice was barely audible over the wind. "He said it was supposed to be a staged accident, just a warning, to scare a woman who was causing trouble, a woman who wouldn't sell, a woman who was trying to stop the railroad survey." She was weeping openly now, silent tears carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. He said her name was Eleanor Merritt. The carefully ordered, empty world Colt had built for himself collapsed. The official story, the one the half-drunk deputy from Sagebrush had given him, was a highway robbery gone wrong. 2 drifters, they'd said, tried to take her horse and her ring. She fought back. A tragic, random act of violence on a lonely trail. He had never believed it. Not in his gut. Eleanor could handle drifters. She could ride and shoot as well as any man, but he had been so consumed by the black, suffocating fog of his own grief that he had lacked the will to question it, to dig for a truth he wasn't sure he could bear to find. "The law," Colt said, his voice thick, "called it highwaymen." "It wasn't," Rowan whispered, shaking her head violently. "It was paid for. Silas, he was supposed to fire the warning shot, to shoot her horse. But his partner, the other man Silas, said he yelled, 'Finish it.' And he did. Silas, he watched. He took Pike's money for watching." Colt pushed away from the table. He turned his back on her, walking the few paces to the single and frost-covered window. He stared out into the swirling gray. Nothing, his breath fogging the glass. Pike, a man who smiled in church, a man who shook hands with the mayor, a man who had murdered his wife for land, for water. "After Silas died," Rowan said to his back, her voice gaining a desperate, frantic edge, as if she knew she was running out of time, "I had to bury him. I went through his things to find money for a pine box, and I found them. Letters, memos, most of it was coded, I think, railroad talk. But I saw the names, Eleanor and Sagebrush Water Rights. Colt turned slowly. The water rights. Of course. It was never just the land. It was the water. The creek that ran through Eleanor's property. The one that fed this whole high valley. Pike didn't just want a path for his tracks. He wanted the lifeblood of the entire territory. His last words, Rowan continued, her eyes wide and haunted. He grabbed my hand. I thought he was already gone, but he squeezed. His eyes opened. He looked right at me. He said, "Find Colt Merritt. You have to find him. Tell him the truth if you want your soul to rest. Tell him Pike." So I did. I took what little money was left, and our last horse. I think Pike's men or someone they must have known Silas talked. They followed me from Copper Willow. They caught up to me 2 days out. They took my horse. They just left me. I ran. I've been walking. Through the storm. I didn't know where I was going. I just walked. Then I saw the barn, the light from your lamp. Earlier, I just wanted to get out of the wind. I crawled into the straw. I must have been dreaming. I said her name. I'm so sorry. She finished, her confession spent, and there was nothing left but the sound of the fire and the wind and her own ragged breathing. Colt stood there, weighing her words, weighing her. He was a man torn. His every instinct screamed that this was a lie, a trap. A woman shows up in a storm, whispering his wife's name, telling a story that conveniently names his new, powerful enemy. It was too perfect. He wanted to bray his gun on the table, drag her back out into the snow, and let the storm finish what it had started. He wanted to be alone with his grief again. But she knew about the water rights. She knew Eleanor's name, and she knew Pike's. He felt a cold, familiar weight settle in his chest. It was the feeling he'd had as a scout, reading a trail, knowing a trap was ahead but having no choice but to spring it. It was the feeling of duty. Not to this woman, but to the ghost in the ground, to Eleanor. If this story was a lie, the woman would die. If this story was true, then killing the messenger, the only link to his wife's murderers, would be a betrayal far worse than just letting her die. It would be a second murder. He would be letting them win. He walked to the corner of the cabin and grabbed a heavy wool blanket from a storage chest. He tossed it at her. It landed on her lap. "You stay tonight," he said. His voice was final, a judge's sentence. "By the fire. You don't move from that rug." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a faint, desperate hope. "Tomorrow," he continued, walking back to the table. He picked up the Colt Navy, the heavy steel feeling balanced and familiar in his hand. He didn't holster it. He just held it, his thumb resting near the hammer. "At dawn, we ride. We go to the trail. We go to where Eleanor died." He looked down at her, his face a mask of iron, his eyes holding no comfort, only a terrible, conditional promise. "You will show me what your husband told you. And if what you say is just wind, I'll let the wind take you." The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean and terribly bright. The sky was a high cloudless blue that offered no comfort, a sheet of polished turquoise that seemed to amplify the cold. The wind had died down to a sharp, steady breeze, but the temperature had dropped further, settling into a bitter, biting stillness that crept under clothes and into the bones. The sun, a weak, pale disk in the east, cast long, distorted blue shadows across the unbroken white of the snow. Colt had given Rowan a pair of Eleanor's old wool trousers, which she wore clumsily under her torn skirt, and a pair of heavy socks stuffed into oversized, worn-out boots. He had given her no food, only a tin cup of hot, black coffee, which she drank while huddled by the embers. He had said nothing. He had simply checked his rifle, holstered his Navy revolver, and motioned her to the door. He had saddled only one horse, Hades, the black stallion. The horse's breath plumed in the air, its dark coat a stark contrast to the snow. Colt mounted in one fluid motion, then reached down a hand, his face impassive. "Up," he said. It wasn't an offer. It was a command. Rowan hesitated, then took his hand. His grip was hard and impersonal, and he hauled her up, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She was small, and he could feel the frailness of her back pressed against his chest. It was an unwelcome, unsettling intimacy. He ignored it, gathering the reins, and kicked the stallion into a steady, ground-eating walk. They rode through a landscape of ghosts. The pines were laden with snow, their branches drooping, and the high plains rolled away in every direction. An ocean of white. They crossed Willow Ford Creek, the water running black and sluggish between shelves of thick ice. The horses' hooves made a dull thud, thud, thud on the frozen earth, the only sound besides the squeak of the saddle leather and the faint, high whistle of the wind through the rock formations. Rowan sat rigid, her hands clutching the saddle horn so tightly her knuckles were white. She could feel the solid, dangerous wall of his body behind her, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. He was not a comfort. He was the man who held her life in his hands, a life that depended on the accuracy of a dead man's confession. Colt said nothing. He simply rode, his eyes scanning the horizon, though his gaze was turned inward, fixed on the place they were going. This was a pilgrimage he had avoided for 2 years. He had taken the long way around this pass, even when it added miles to his journey to town. He had not allowed himself to stand on that ground again. Now, this ghost of a woman was forcing him back, dragging him by the hand to the very center of his pain. After an hour, he reined the stallion in, pulling him to a stop. They had entered a narrow cut between 2 low, weathered bluffs of red rock. The trail here was sheltered from the wind, the snow not as deep, revealing the frozen, stony path beneath. It was a quiet place, an empty place. "Here," he said. His voice was not his own. It was a dead, flat sound, like stones striking stones. Rowe looked around. It was an unremarkable bend in a trail, just rocks and snow and skeletal brush. Colt dismounted, the movement stiff. He did not help her down. He simply walked a few paces, his boots crunching, and stopped. He stared at the rock face of the northern bluff. He pointed. "Here," he said again. Rowan slid clumsily from the saddle, her legs numb, and stumbled over to where he stood. She followed his finger. There, on the flat, gray face of the sandstone, was a dark, puckered scar, a chip in the rock, blackened by the lead of a heavy-caliber bullet. It was about 4 feet off the ground. "She was on her mare," Colt said, his voice still that terrible monotone, his eyes fixed on the bullet mark. "The horse bolted. She fell here." He nudged a patch of snow with his boot. "Tell me what your husband said." Rowan stared at the bullet mark. It felt like an eye, a single, dead eye staring back at them. A witness. The air was thin, and she found it hard to breathe. The cold was secondary. The air here was thick with something else, something heavy and suffocating. It was the weight of a moment, frozen in time. She began to tremble, not from the cold, but from the story she carried. "He said they waited," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Not here, up there." She pointed a shaking, purpled finger toward the low ridge of brush and rocks just above the trail. "He said there were 2 of them. Him and the other man. They lay behind the rocks. They waited all morning. He said the signal was a whistle, a bird call, 3 notes. When she came around the bend," Colt's face was a mask of granite. He did not move, did not look at her. He just stared at the trail. "She was wearing a scarf," Rowan choked out, the memory of her husband's fevered voice sharp in her own ears. "A red one, a bright red silk scarf. Silas said it fluttered in the wind. He said that's how he knew it was her. Pike had told them about the scarf." Colt's entire body went rigid. It was a barely perceptible tightening, a contraction of his muscles, as if he'd been struck. The scarf. It had been Eleanor's favorite, a gift he had bought her in Cheyenne, bright as a cardinal's wing. He had buried it with her. He had never spoken of it to anyone, not the deputy, not the minister, no one. Only he and Eleanor had known she was wearing it that day. And now, this woman, It was the proof, the terrible, undeniable proof. She was not a liar. She was a messenger, carrying a truth that had come straight from the killer's mouth. He said the plan was to fire a warning. Rowan rushed on, desperate to empty herself of the poison. To hit the rock right in front of her, to scare her, to make her fall, to break a leg, maybe, just to stop her from fighting Mr. Pike. But just as Silas was lining up the shot, just as he was letting out his breath, the other man, the one who yelled, "Finish it," he fired. Not a warning. He shot her, in the back. And Silas said the other man was laughing. He said he'd just made an extra $50. She stopped, her story told. The silence that fell was absolute. It was heavier than the snow, colder than the wind. It was the silence of the grave. Colt turned his head slowly and looked at her. His steel-gray eyes were no longer cold. They were burning. They were filled with a black, bottomless rage that was so profound it looked like madness. But beneath the rage was a new, raw, devastating agony. The robbery gone wrong had been a comfort. A senseless, random act of violence. It was the wilderness. It was fate. It was bad luck. It was something he could hate, but not fight. This was different. This was calculated. This was a $2 execution, ordered by a man in a clean suit and carried out for a bonus. This was a murder, and he, Colt Merritt, had let it stand. He had walled himself in with his grief, like a coward, and had believed the lie because it was easier than finding the truth. The rage he felt for Pike was a white-hot sun, but the rage he felt for himself was a black, cold void. He moved, his body seeming to unlock. He stepped past Rowan, walked to the spot he had indicated, and slowly, his knees cracking, he knelt in the snow. He reached out a gloved hand and brushed the white powder away, as if he could clear the last 2 years. He knelt on the frozen ground where he had held her, where he had tried to push her blood back into her body, where he had felt the last faint flutter of her pulse under his fingers. He had whispered her name, over and over, begging her not to leave him. But she had. He bowed his head, his wide shoulders shaking. He was not weeping. He was simply breaking. Rowan watched him, and her own fear was swallowed by a vast, suffocating wave of shame. Her husband, the man she had fed and mended and lain beside. His hands had been part of this. He had taken gold, stained with this woman's blood, and brought it into their home. She was the widow of a monster, and she was standing here, breathing the same air as the man whose life that monster had destroyed, asking for what absolution? She deserved nothing. She deserved the storm. She deserved the cold. She squeezed her hands together, digging her nails into her palms, welcoming the small, sharp pain. A sound ripped the air apart, a crack, sharp and flat, followed by the high-pitched whine of a ricochet. A puff of snow and stone fragments exploded from the rock face. Not 3 feet from where Colt knelt, someone was shooting at them. The past 2 years of fog and grief evaporated from Colt's mind, burned away by the flash of gunpowder. The soldier, the scout, the survivor, took over. He did not hesitate. He did not even look. He lunged forward from his knees, his right hand grabbing a fistful of Rowan's coat. He yanked her off her feet, dragging her down behind a broad, snow-covered boulder at the base of the bluff. "Stay down," he roared, the voice no longer dead, but alive and full of deadly command. He landed on the icy ground beside her, rolling, his hand already on the grip of his navy. He drew the gun, his movements a blur of practiced violence, and brought it up, scanning the ridge Rowan had pointed to earlier. The shooter's position. He saw it. A faint, telltale puff of blue-gray smoke, dissipating in the cold, clear air. It was coming from the exact cluster of rocks she had described. Colt didn't aim. He didn't need to. He snapped his arm up, firing twice, the heavy boom of the .36 caliber revolver echoing like cannon fire in the narrow cut. He wasn't trying to hit the shooter. He was firing to make him duck, to make him move. He heard a muffled curse from the ridge. the sound of scrambling boots on loose rock. He pushed himself up onto his elbows. His eyes narrowed, tracking the sound. "He's running," he snarled. He and Rowan were pressed together behind the rock, their bodies side by side in the snow. The smell of sulfur and smoke filled the air, mingling with the scent of cold pine. Their breaths came in ragged, white plumes, two animals gone to ground, their hearts hammering in unison. For the first time, they were not a ghost and a widower. They were a team. They were a target. Colt fired once more, the bullet screaming off the rocks where he'd last heard the sound. Then there was silence, broken only by the fading echo of the gunshots and the sound of a horse, crashing desperately through the brush, fading fast in the direction of Sagebrush Crossing. Silence fell again, but it was a different silence. It was charged, alive, ringing with the aftermath of violence. Colt lay there for a long 10 count, his ears straining, his gun steady. Nothing. The shooter was gone. He slowly pushed himself to his feet, holstering his revolver. He looked down at Rowan. She was still pressed against the boulder, her eyes wide with terror, her face as white as the snow she was lying in. He reached down his hand. This time, it was not an order. This time, it was different. She took it, her hand trembling inside its worn glove. He pulled her to her feet. He walked past her, out from behind the rock. He went to the trail and knelt, his eyes on the ground. He didn't have to look hard. The shooter had been in a hurry. He had left a clear set of boot prints in the snow, leading from his hiding place to a tethered horse, and the horse's tracks were fresh, deep, and heading northeast, toward Sagebrush Crossing, toward Pike. Colt stood up. He looked at the trail, then at the bullet scar on the rock, then at the tracks leading away. He had his answer. He had his proof. They had tried to silence the messenger. They had tried to silence him. They had failed. He turned and looked at Rowan. She was watching him, her face a mask of fear and exhaustion. He saw her, really saw her, perhaps for the first time, not as the ghost of her husband's sins, but as a survivor, as the only other person on earth who knew the truth. His face was still hard, still carved from granite, but the deadness was gone. In his eyes, the fire that had been burning for Pike was now tempered, focused, sharpened to a razor's edge. "We're done waiting," he said, his voice a low, cold promise. "We're done taking it." He walked back to the horse. "We're going to drag Pike and his whole pack of hounds into the light." Sagebrush Crossing was no longer the sleepy trading post Colt remembered. The railroad had breathed afoul, new life into it. The main street, a wide, muddy artery, was choked with the skeletons of new construction. Raw pine buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with canvas tents, and the air, thick with red dust and the smell of sawdust, rang with the sound of hammers and the distant, metallic clang of steel on steel. It was a town growing faster than its own conscience, a place built on promises and fueled by whiskey. Saloons, a new 2-story bank, a land office, and a clapboard church all vied for space. Everywhere, large, painted signs proclaimed the imminent arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad, praising Bartholomew Pike as the town's savior. Colt had avoided this place, this monument to his wife's murder, for 2 years. He had skirted it on his rare trips for supplies, riding miles out of his way to avoid the main street, to avoid the faces of the people who had either forgotten Eleanor or had been paid to. Now, he rode straight down the center of it, Hades picking his way through the ruts, with Rowan seated behind him. He was no longer a grieving recluse. He was a ghost, back from the grave, and he was carrying a gun. He dismounted in front of the livery, his movements stiff from the long ride back. He helped Rowan down, his hand impersonal on her elbow, and left Hades with the stable boy. Along with a coin, he kept his rifle, cradled in his arm. He had left his cabin with no supplies, no extra ammunition, only a purpose. "We need a room," he said, his voice low, "and food. Then we find out what this town knows." He led the way to the Silver Star Saloon, the only place in town that also rented rooms above. The moment they pushed through the bat-wing doors, a wall of noise and smoke hit them. It was mid-afternoon, but the saloon was crowded. Men in dusty trail clothes, men in cheap suits, and a few rough-looking characters who were clearly on someone's payroll all clustered around the tables. The air smelled of spilled beer, stale sweat, and desperation. Rowan instinctively pulled the brim of the old hat Colt had given her lower over her face. She could feel the conversations pause, the heads turn, the eyes slide over her. She was a woman, which was enough to draw stares, but she was a woman in trousers, her face grimy, walking in the shadow of a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a thunderstorm. The reputation of her late husband, Silas, was a foul perfume that clung to her. In this world, a gunslinger's widow was a story, and usually a sad or a sordid one. She felt their speculative, dismissive glances like small, dirty hands. Colt, however, seemed oblivious. He moved through the crowd like a boulder parting a stream. He walked to the bar, his rifle still held loosely in his arm, and laid a coin on the wet wood. "A room," he said to the bartender, "for the night, and a plate of whatever's hot." The bartender, a portly man with a stained apron, eyed the rifle, then Colt's face, then Rowan. He was about to speak when the doors to the saloon opened again, and a different kind of silence fell. Colt turned his head. Bartholomew Pike stood in the doorway. He was exactly as Colt remembered, only more so. He was a man who wore his importance like his clothes, and both were expensive. His suit was fine gray wool, impeccably cut. His starched white shirt a beacon in the dim room. A silver tie pin, shaped like a small locomotive, glinted at his throat. He was flanked by two men, hard-faced and broad-shouldered, who wore their coats unbuttoned despite the cold. Pike smiled, a broad, practiced expression that did not reach his cold, blue eyes. He was the picture of the benevolent benefactor, the bringer of civilization. He was shaking hands with the town's preacher, a small, nervous man, and the new deputy, Macklin Dorsey. "A generous contribution to the new steeple, Reverend," Pike was saying, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that carried easily. "The railroad is proud to be a partner in this community's bright future." Colt stood perfectly still at the bar. He did not move, did not breathe. He just watched. Pike's gaze swept the room, the gaze of a man assessing his property. He was about to turn and leave, his handshaking complete, when his eyes met Colt's. It was not a large movement. It was almost nothing. But for a fraction of a second, Pike's smile faltered. His eyes widened, just slightly. The blood seemed to drain from his face, before rushing back in a dull, angry flush. He had not recognized Colt at first, not the clean-shaven rancher from 2 years ago. He was seeing the bearded, hard-eyed man with the rifle. He was seeing a problem he had paid to have buried. Pike's recovery was instant. He composed his features, gave a curt, dismissive nod as if to a stranger, and turned, walking out of the saloon with the preacher. He left his two men behind. They did not follow. They moved, casual but deliberate, to a table near the door and sat down, their eyes on Colt. Colt turned back to the bar. The bartender slid a key toward him. "Room 3, he grunted, his demeanor suddenly respectful. "Food's coming. We'll eat in the corner," Colt said. He led Rowan to a small, round table in the darkest corner of the saloon. A table that put his back to the wall and gave him a clear view of the entire room, including Pike's two men. A woman brought them plates of beans and salt pork and 2 mugs of coffee. It was the first real food Rowan had eaten in days, but she could barely swallow. The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled snake in the middle of the floor. Colt ate slowly, methodically, his gaze never resting in one place for long. He was listening. The conversations, which had resumed, were a low hum, but he was a scout, trained to pick out the important sounds. Pike's man offered him 40 cents on the dollar for the north pasture. A man at the next table was saying, "Old man Hemming said no. Next week, his prize bull just turns up dead, poisoned. Hemming sold on Tuesday. Ain't just the land," another voice chimed in. "It's the water. Pike's got the rights to the whole of Drywater Gulch now. Squeezed out the last 3 ranchers." Then a name. He's lucky he didn't end up like that Merritt woman, the first man said with a grim chuckle. That stubborn woman. Heard she pulled a gun on the surveyors. Died for a worthless creek that Pike was going to get anyway. Some people just don't know when to fold. Rowan, who had been staring at her plate, saw Colt's hand. He had set his fork down. His hand was resting on the table, and it was clenched so tightly that his knuckles were bone white. His whole body was vibrating with a silent, murderous rage. He was a bomb, and the fuse had just been lit. He was about to stand up. He was about to kill someone, without thinking, without even looking at him. Rowan slid her hand under the table. She didn't grab him. She just touched him. Her fingers brushed the back of his wrist. It was a small, hesitant, almost imperceptible contact. A feather-light touch, cool and trembling. It was enough. Colt froze. The touch was a shock. A sudden, unexpected anchor in the red sea of his fury. It was the first human contact he had felt in 2 years that was not violent. It did not calm him, but it held him. It gave him a reason to pause, to pull his rage back from the brink, to channel it. He took a slow, deep breath, and his hand, under the table, slowly uncurled. He did not acknowledge her. He did not look at her. He just sat there. The moment was broken by a new voice, loud and abrasive. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." A man was standing over their table. He was large, unkempt, and smelled of stale whiskey. He was one of the men who had been talking at the bar. He wasn't looking at Colt. He was leering at Rowan. "Silas Pierce's widow, ain't ya?" he slurred. "Heard you were available, though I also heard you were bad luck. Silas was always lucky at cards till he met you. Then he was just lucky to be dead." The man laughed, and a few of his friends at the bar joined in. Rowan shrank back in her chair, her face draining of all color, the old, familiar shame washing over her. Pike's 2 men at the door watched, their faces amused. Colt Merritt did not move quickly. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. He set his coffee mug down on the table. The sound a quiet, definitive click. He turned his head, his steel-gray eyes rising to meet the man's. He didn't stand up. He didn't need to. "You've got a choice," Colt said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that was more threat than the man's shout. "You can finish your drink at the bar, or you can try and finish it on the floor." "I don't much care which." The man's drunken smile faltered. He was not stupid enough to miss the flat. Lethal promise in Colt's eyes. He had seen that look before, in men who used their guns for more than show. He looked at Colt, then at the rifle leaning against the wall, then at the 2 men Pike had left. They offered no help, just watched with predatory interest. "Ah, hell," the man grumbled, trying to save face. "She ain't worth the trouble." He spat on the floor near Rowan's feet and swaggered back to the bar, his friends suddenly finding their drinks very interesting. The saloon grew quiet again. The tension was thicker than before. "That's enough," a new voice cut in. Deputy Macklin Dorsey was standing by their table. He was a young man, trying to look older than his years, his hand resting on his own gun belt. He had been one of the men shaking Pike's hand. His eyes flicked from Colt to Rowan, and he sighed. "Look, Merritt, I don't know what you're doing back in town, and I don't want to know, but you're drawing flies. Pike, he's the law here now, in all but name. I'm telling you, for your own good. Finish your meal, get your woman, and ride out. There's nothing for you here but trouble." Colt looked at Dorsey, his expression unreadable. "My wife is buried here. Deputy, I'd say I have a stake in the place." Dorsey's face flushed. He knew who Colt was. "Eleanor, that was a tragedy. Merritt, a robbery. You can't change what happened. Don't go stirring a pot that's best left to sit." "I'm not stirring it," Colt said, his voice cold. "I'm just here to see what floats to the top." Dorsey's eyes hardened. He was in over his head, and he knew it. He looked at Pike's 2 men, who were watching him. He looked at Colt. He seemed to be making a decision. He leaned in, as if to say something threatening. "You're a fool if you stay," he hissed, for the benefit of the room, But as he leaned in, he turned, his body momentarily shielding his hand from the rest of the saloon. He bumped the table, and as he did, his hand brushed Colt's. When he straightened up, Colt's hand was still on the table, but now there was a small, tightly folded piece of paper in it, where Rowan's hand had been moments before. "Last warning, Merritt," Dorsey said, his voice loud. He tapped the brim of his hat and walked out of the saloon, his stride a little too quick. Colt sat there, his hand covering the note. He waited. Pike's 2 men, seeing the deputy leave and the confrontation end, finally relaxed. They ordered drinks. Colt slowly, under the table, unfolded the piece of paper. He didn't need to bring it up to read it. He just needed to feel the pencil-scrawled words. He looked down into his lap. 4 words. Jonas Reed. Buffalo Soldier. Edge of town. Nose. Colt folded the paper back up. He looked at Rowan. She was watching him. Her face still pale, but her eyes were questioning. "We'll take that room," he said, his voice low. "We rest. We wait for dark. Then we go see a man named Jonas Reed." He stood up, grabbing his rifle, and put his hand on Rowan's back. A simple, proprietary gesture to guide her toward the stairs. "Let's go." That night, they did not stay in the room. The boarding house had a small, rickety porch on the 2nd floor, overlooking the main street. The air was frigid, but it was clean, and it was away from the smoke and the whispers. They stood by the railing, 2 dark shapes in the moonlight. Below them, Sagebrush Crossing was lit up. The saloons glowed, spilling yellow light and the sound of tinny pianos into the street. It looked like a party, but Colt and Rowan knew better. They were looking at a predator's den, a cluster of false lights in a vast, dangerous dark. A town built on a lie, shining with the profits of a murder. Rowan was shivering, pulling Eleanor's old coat tighter around her. Colt stood beside her, not touching, but close. The space between them was charged, not with the heat of the saloon, but with a different kind of energy, a shared danger, a shared secret. "She must have been very brave," Rowan said, her voice small, her breath a white cloud. "Your wife?" Colt didn't answer for a long time. He just watched the lights. "She was," he said finally, his voice rough. "She was stubborn, and she believed in what was right. She thought that was enough. She was wrong." He turned his head and looked at her, his face shadowed, his eyes catching the distant, cold light of the moon. "Pike thought he buried her. He thought he buried the truth. He's about to find out he just planted a seed." Rowan looked up at him, at the hard line of his jaw, the resolve in his eyes. And in that moment, standing on a dark porch in a town that wanted them gone, surrounded by enemies, she felt the first, unfamiliar, and terrifying flicker of something that was not fear. It was a spark, and it was starting to catch. They waited until the saloon lights had been extinguished, one by one, until the only light on the main street came from the cold, indifferent moon. Sagebrush Crossing was a town that slept in shifts, and the hours just before dawn were the quietest. They slipped out the back of the boarding house, avoiding the main street, and moved through the alleyways, their boots silent in the patches of snow and frozen mud. The edge of town was not a clear line, but a slow decay. The new, raw pine buildings gave way to older, more weathered shacks, which in turn gave way to canvas tents and lean-tos. This was where the people who served the town, but were not wanted in it, lived: the Chinese laundrymen, the freighters, the displaced, and the free black folk who had come west looking for a life, only to find the same old lines drawn in new dirt. Jonas Reed's cabin was the last one, pushed up against a low, rocky bluff, as if it were trying to retreat from the town altogether. It was small, barely more than a shack, with a crooked chimney puffing a thin, defiant line of smoke into the night air. A 3-legged dog, old and gray-muzzled, lay on the porch. It didn't bark, but its head came up, and a low, rumbling growl started deep in its chest. "Stay here," Colt said to Rowan, his voice a low command. He left her in the shadow of a water trough and stepped into the small yard, his hands raised and open, away from his gun. "Jonas Reed," he called out, his voice not loud, but pitched to carry. "My name is Colt Merritt. Deputy Dorsey said you might be a man to talk to." The growling stopped. The cabin door creaked open a few inches, revealing a slice of darkness. A moment later, a man stepped out onto the porch, filling the doorway. Jonas Reed was a big man. He was tall, and his shoulders were as wide as the doorway he stood in. He was dressed in old Union Army trousers and a heavy wool shirt, even in the moonlight. Colt could see the deep, ropey scar that pulled at the left side of his neck, a souvenir from some long-past battle. He held a double-barreled shotgun, its bores looking like two dark, empty eyes, and he held it with an ease that meant he knew exactly how to use it. "Deputy Dorsey's a pup," Jonas's voice rumbled, deep and resonant. "And pups get scared. They send other folks to do their barking. I ain't got nothing to say to you. Merritt." "I'm not here for Dorsey," Colt said, standing his ground. "I'm here about my wife." The shotgun did not waver. "I'm here about Eleanor." The name hung in the frigid air between them. The old dog whined. Just once, Jonas Reed's eyes, hard and suspicious, narrowed. He studied Colt for a long 10 count. "Eleanor Merritt's dead," Jonas said, his voice flat. "She was murdered." Colt countered, his own voice raw. "And the man who paid for it is sitting in the center of your town, shaking hands with the preacher." Colt reached into his pocket slowly. He pulled out the crumpled note from Dorsey. He didn't toss it. He held it out. "He gave me this. He's scared, but he's not wrong. He said you knew." Jonas looked at the note, then back at Colt's face. He looked past him, into the shadows, and saw the small, trembling shape of Rowan. He let out a long, slow breath. "Get in," he said, stepping back and lowering the shotgun. "Both of you, before Pike's night watch makes his rounds." The inside of the cabin was as sparse as Colt's, but it was different. It was meticulously clean. A worn-out cavalry saber hung over the small fireplace. A stack of letters, tied with twine, sat on a small, neat table. The air smelled of wood smoke and old coffee. Jonas motioned them to the fire. "She used to come here," Jonas said, his back to them as he bolted the door. "Mrs. Merritt. She was a proper lady, but she wasn't soft." He turned, his large frame seeming to soak up the dim light. "I was a Buffalo soldier, 10th Cavalry. After the war, well, folks ain't as grateful for your service as you'd think. Got this." He touched the scar on his neck. "Drifted. Ended up here. Was working the livery. She was the only person in this town who looked me in the eye, who used my full name. She knew I could read and write." Jonas continued, a deep sadness in his voice. "She said she needed a man who was good with numbers, but more than that, a man who was invisible to folks like Pike. A man he'd never suspect." He sat down on a low stool. "So, I worked for her, 2-3 nights a week. I'd come to her place. She'd ride out, talk to the ranchers. Pike was convincing. She'd get the stories, the threats, the price he paid for a poisoned well or a burned barn, and I'd write it all down. In her ledger, we called it her black book." Colt's heart ached. While he had been lost in his own world, tending his horses, Eleanor had been fighting a war, alone. She knew he was going to kill her, Jonas said quietly. She wasn't naive. The week before it happened, she came here. It was late. She had the book. She said it was getting too dangerous. She said Pike had started watching her. "She made me hide it," he said. "Where?" Colt demanded, leaning forward. "Here." Jonas shook his head. "No, not here. He'd toss this place in a second. No, she had a strange sense of humor. That woman. She picked the one place in town that Pike himself built, the one place he'd never think to look." He paused. "The new church, top of the bell tower. She said the ladder was so rotten, only a sinner or a saint would dare climb it, and she wasn't sure which one of us was which." Rowan, who had been silent, her hands held out to the fire, let out a small, sharp breath. Jonas turned his gaze on her. What about my husband? Rowan asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas Pierce? Was he in her book? Jonas's face softened with something like pity. She didn't just write down the big names. Ma'am, she wrote down the small ones. Too, the tools. He looked back at Colt. Yeah, his name is in there. Hand hired for warning shots. She wrote, but she added a note. She was a careful woman. He looked at Rowan again, his voice gentle. She wrote, do not trust this one. Saw him talking to a man, not Pike's usual man, behind the bank. I think there's another player. Rowan's heart constricted. A new player. Silas. He hadn't just been a tool for Pike. He had been a snake, playing his own game, willing to sell his services to the highest bidder. The shame she felt was laced with a cold, bitter clarity. We have to get it, Colt said, his voice hard with resolve. Now, Jonas said, nodding, is the best time. The whole town's asleep, and Pike's 2 watchers are drunk in the saloon. I saw him when I went for wood. The 3 of them slipped back out into the night. The church stood at the end of the street, a stark, white skeleton in the moonlight. Its new, unpainted steeple a sharp triangle against the stars. The front door was locked, but Jonas led them around the back, to a small vestry door, prized open with a length of steel from Jonas's pack. Inside, the church was colder than the street. It smelled of raw lumber and new paint. Moonlight streamed through the tall, clear glass windows, painting the aisle in silver and black. The silence was absolute, a heavy, holy stillness. At the back, a narrow door opened onto a flight of stairs. They were more like a ladder, a steep, rickety ascent into total darkness. This is it, Jonas whispered. I'll go first. I know the bad steps. You, he said to Colt. Come second. You, ma'am, he said to Rowan. Stay between him and me, and for God's sake, do not look down. Jonas lit a small, shielded lantern, casting just enough light to see their feet, one by one. They began to climb. The ascent was terrifying. The wooden rungs were old, some of them salvaged from older buildings, and they groaned and popped under Jonas's weight. Dust, thick and dry, rained down on them, making Rowan cough, a sound that seemed deafening in the enclosed space. The air grew colder, staler. They climbed past the first landing, into the belfry itself. Here, the great dark shape of the new bell hung suspended, a metal giant, cold and silent. The air was filled with the smell of metal and bird droppings. A few high open arches let in the moaning of the wind, a high, lonely sound that seemed to play across the cold bronze. Up here, Jonas said, his voice echoing slightly. He was on a small platform, right under the bell's main support beam. Colt and Rowan followed, their breath coming in ragged plumes, their bodies close together in the cramped, dark space. The proximity was not intimate. It was practical, a shared, huddling in the dark kind of survival. Jonas held the lantern high. She said near the beam, in a crevice. He ran his hand along the massive, rough-hewn log. Ah! His fingers found a loose piece of wood. He pulled it away, revealing a dark, rectangular hole. Reaching inside, he pulled out an object, wrapped in heavy, oiled cloth. He handed it to Colt. It was heavy. It was real. Colt's hands, which were steady with a gun, trembled as he took it. He set the lantern on the platform and, with fumbling fingers, unwrapped the oilcloth. It was a simple, leather-bound ledger, the kind a shopkeeper would use. He opened it. The first page was not numbers. It was a name, written in a strong, clear, feminine hand. Eleanor Merritt, her book. Colt Merritt touched the name. He traced the letters of her signature. The ink faded but strong. It was as if he were touching her hand. All the rage, all the grief, all the cold resolve of the last 2 days welled up in his throat, and for a second, he could not breathe. It was not just a book. It was her voice. It was her last will and testament. Look, Jonas said, pointing to a page near the end. Her last entries. Colt turned the pages, the dry paper whispering, and he found it. The entry was dated 2 days before her death. Copper Willow Basin ambush. The words were stark. Underneath, her clear, precise script had laid it all out. Pike. $500 to the men. Silas Pierce. Frank Hamer. Deputy Sims $100 to look the other way, and find drifters. Land clear title to be signed over to Pike by mistake at the land office. Order warning shot. Frighten. Do not kill. And then, at the bottom of the page, a final, shaky line. A question, written in a different, more hurried hand, as if she had just learned something new, something that terrified her. Frank Hames seen with new money, talking to someone, not Pike. Silas was there. The order was to scare, not to kill. Who changed the order? Rowan read the words over Colt's shoulder, her hand flying to her mouth. Frank Hamer. The other man, the one who had yelled, "Finish it," the one who had laughed. A third party, Jonas said, his deep voice grim. She was right. Pike wanted her scared, but someone else wanted her dead. Someone who had the money to buy Hamer, and maybe buy your husband, too, ma'am, to change the warning to a murder at the last second. Rowan felt a cold, sick relief wash over her. It was not absolution. Her husband was still a monster, but he was a pawn. He had been outplayed by a bigger, more ruthless player. Eleanor had seen it, even in the end. She had seen the truth more clearly than anyone. Colt closed the book. The thud of the leather cover was a final, definitive sound in the high, cold tower. He stood there for a moment, the book in his hand, a tangible piece of his dead wife. He was no longer just a widower seeking revenge. He was an executor. He looked at Jonas, and then at Rowan, the three of them, a broken soldier, a grieving husband, and a guilty widow, huddled together in the dark, under a silent bell. "We have the proof," Colt said, his voice flat and cold as the iron bell above them. "We'll use her own words. We'll burn Pike's mask off his face in front of the whole town." He turned, leading the way back to the treacherous ladder. "But first," he added, his voice a low, dark promise, "we have to survive till dawn, because he knows we're here, and now he'll do anything to keep us. And this book, from seeing the light." The return from the bell tower was a silent, hurried descent into a town that now felt like a hunting trap. They didn't go back to the boarding house. The key to room 3 was a useless piece of metal. They returned to Jonas Reed's cabin, the only place that was, for the moment, a relative sanctuary. News in a town like Sagebrush Crossing traveled faster than a prairie fire. The return of Colt Merritt, the recluse, would have been talk enough, but his return with a strange woman, the widow of a known hired gun, was a story too good to keep quiet. And Pike, a man who had built his empire on knowing everything, had heard it. The confrontation in the saloon, the deputy's involvement, the shooter sent to the pass, these were not random events. They were the tightening of a noose. Pike began to move. His 2 men, the ones from the saloon, were no longer just watching. They were organizing. Men who usually spent their days drinking away a paycheck suddenly had purpose. They stood on street corners, their eyes flat and watchful. Jonas, stepping out for a moment to check his yard, was openly followed by a man he didn't recognize. The bartender from the Silver Star suddenly refused to sell Jonas any more coffee, his eyes averted in shame. Pike was closing the circle, paying $1 here, $1 there, buying the town's silence and its complicity. Inside the small cabin, the 3 of them were prisoners of their own knowledge. The ledger sat on the table, a leather-bound bomb. "He's making his move," Jonas said, rubbing his scarred neck as he watched the street from behind a dirty curtain. "Tomorrow, he's called the auction, the last of the Drywater Gulch lots, the ones who haven't sold. He aims to break them, right in the public square. He wants the whole valley to see him win. Then that's when we stop him," Colt said. His voice was cold, certain. He was cleaning his rifle, the oiled rag moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. "He wants a public victory. We'll give him a public execution. We'll use Eleanor's own words to hang him. The plan was simple and desperate. When Pike stood before the town, before the preacher, the ranchers, and the deputy, Jonas would step forward. He would present the ledger. Colt would stand with him, his gun a clear warning against any interference. They would demand Deputy Dorsey read the entries concerning the land fraud, the threats, the murder of Eleanor Merritt. He'll have men everywhere, Jonas warned. Not just his usual 2. He'll have a dozen guns, maybe 20. They're paid, Colt said, not looking up from his rifle. They're not loyal. Men who fight for $1 don't fight hard when the man paying them is about to fall. We just have to make him fall. The ranchers? Rowan said, her voice quiet but clear. They both looked at her. She had been silent, studying the ledger. The other ranchers, the ones who sold, the ones who are about to lose everything, they'll be there. They're the ones who need to hear this. But how do we get them to stand with you? Pike will have the main road into town watched. Colt looked at her, a new, sharp respect in his eyes. She was right. He'll have a roadblock, Colt said, his mind working quickly. A toll, probably, to register for the auction, to keep out anyone who isn't already broken. We need a way in for them, Jonas said. For the ones who still have some fight left. There is one, Colt said. He stood, the rifle reassembled. The old cattle trail. It comes in behind the livery. Pike won't know it, but his men will have fenced it off with the new railroad line. He looked at Rowan. We need to scout it. Tonight. The 2 of us. Jonas, you stay here. You're the one they're watching. Dusk was a cold, purple bruise on the horizon. Colt and Rowan moved on foot, leaving the horses in Jonas's small shed. They kept to the shadows, following the creek bed, circling wide around the town. The air was heavy, the wind picking up, carrying the smell of grit and distant, cold rain. They found the roadblock easily. It was just as Colt had predicted, a new, raw pine toll booth set up on the main road, manned by 2 of Pike's men, their rifles leaning against the wall as they passed a bottle. Amateurs, Colt grunted. He led Rowan further, up a low rise, to where the new railroad fence, a tight, 4-strand barbed wire line, cut across the landscape. And there, just as he'd remembered, was the faint depression of the old cattle trail. He blocked it, Rowan whispered, touching the sharp, new wire. He made a mistake, Colt said. He took a pair of heavy wire cutters from his belt. He didn't cut the wire. That would be too obvious. He moved to the nearest fence post, a heavy, new-set piece of timber. He braced his boot against it and began to work, loosening the staples that held the wires in place. It was hard. Slow work in the fading light. Rowan stood watch. She was not the trembling woman from the barn. Her hands were steady. Her fear was still there. A cold knot in her stomach. But it had been joined by something else, a sharp, clear-eyed focus. Finally, with a protesting screech of metal on wood. Colt pulled the last staple free. The post could now be pushed over, the wires lowered, creating a gap wide enough for a dozen horses to pass through. He set it back in place, a trap waiting to be sprung. Jonas will get word to Hemmings, Colt said, his voice low. Hemmings can spread the word. They can come in, unseen. He turned to go, and then he stopped. The setting sun, a sliver of burning red, caught the high rocks above them. And on that rock, something glinted, not stone, metal. The barrel of a rifle. Down, Colt yelled. He didn't shove Rowan. He tackled her, his body slamming into hers. A solid, desperate force that drove the air from her lungs. They crashed into the dirt and snow just as the evening was ripped apart by a volley of gunfire. At least 4 rifles opened up. Bullets thudded into the ground where they had been standing, screaming as they ricocheted off the rocks behind them. It was an ambush. Pike hadn't just been watching Jonas. He had been watching them. The creek bed, Colt roared, already on his feet, pulling Rowan with him. He shoved his rifle into her hands. Run! He drew his navy, turning to fire back at the ridge, giving her cover. Crack, crack, crack. He fired fast, not aiming, just making them duck. Rowan ran, scrambling, falling to her knees on the loose rock, the heavy rifle clumsy in her hands. She heard Colt behind her, his boots sliding, his gun booming. They tumbled down the short, steep bank into the shallow, half-frozen creek bed. They were out of the direct line of fire, but they were trapped. "Where's Jonas?" Colt snarled, reloading, his eyes scanning the bank above them. "Colt, behind you." The voice wasn't Rowan's. It was Jonas. He was on the far bank, his own shotgun booming, firing both barrels up at the ridge. He had followed them. He had known it was a trap. "Get out of here," Jonas roared, breaking his shotgun to reload. "I'll hold them, like hell," Colt yelled back, climbing the bank to stand with him. A new round of fire erupted from the ridge, angrier now. A bullet hit the tree by Jonas's head, sending a shower of bark and splinters into his face. "Go," Jonas shouted, shoving at Colt. "We go together," Jonas grunted, a sharp intake of breath, and his knees buckled. The shotgun fell from his hands. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his left shoulder. "Jonas!" Rowan screamed. Colt grabbed the big man before he could fall completely, hauling him back down the bank. "Rowan here." Rowan didn't hesitate. She scrambled through the icy water, her fear forgotten, replaced by a terrible, clear purpose. She got on Jonas's other side, wrapping her arm around his waist. Together, they dragged him behind a thicket of willows and a large boulder. The firing from the ridge stopped, replaced by the sound of men moving, shouting, "Coming down the hill. They're coming," Colt said, his voice grim. Jonas was leaning against the rock, his face pale, his breathing ragged. "Go," he rasped. "Merritt, take the book. It's in my—" "Shut up, Jonas," Colt said. "Rowan, your hands." "What? Give me your hands," he commanded. He grabbed her by the wrists and shoved her hands onto the bleeding wound on Jonas's shoulder. "Press down. Hard. Don't let go. No matter what." Rowan cried out as the hot, sticky blood welled up over her fingers. It was the first time she had felt the life draining from someone. She looked down at her hands, covered in the dark, glistening liquid, and she felt a wave of nausea. But then she looked at Jonas's face, his eyes closed in pain, and her hands, of their own accord, pressed down, hard. "Colt," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "They're coming. I see them." Colt stepped out from behind the rock, his revolver steady in his hand. A ghost in the twilight. He fired. A man screamed. He fired again. Another man cursed and fell back. He was a warrior, a man in his element. He was a wall between them and the dark. A bullet snapped past his ear. Another whined off the rock near his head. He grunted, a sharp, sudden sound, and he stumbled. He didn't fall, but he staggered back, his left hand grabbing at his side. "Colt!" Rowan cried, her voice high with a new terror. "I'm fine," he growled, but the words were a lie. He leaned heavily against the rock, his revolver still up, but his face was suddenly pale. Just grazed. He'd been hit. He'd fallen from his horse. Metaphorically. But the result was the same. They were pinned down. 2 wounded men and a woman who had never fired a gun in her life. The firing from the ridge started again, but it was more cautious now. "The horses," Jonas rasped, his eyes open. "In the shed. They think we're on foot." "They're right," Colt said, sliding down the rock to a sitting position, his breathing suddenly shallow. "No," Jonas said. "My spare. In the willows. By the trail. Old cavalry trick. Always have one." Colt looked at Rowan. "Can you ride?" I can. Can you lead a horse with 2 men on it?" Her eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded. "If I have to." "You have to," Colt said. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain, and grabbed his rifle. "Cover me." He shoved the rifle back into her hands. "Point it at the hill. If you see movement, pull the trigger. Don't think, just pull." He and Rowan, with a strength she didn't know she possessed, hauled Jonas to his feet. The next 5 minutes were a blur of nightmare. Colt, his side bleeding, half carried, half dragged Jonas through the creek, while Rowan, her heart hammering, stumbled behind them. The heavy rifle pointed uselessly at the dark. The horse, a steady old mare, was exactly where Jonas said. It took all their strength, but they got Jonas into the saddle. He slumped forward, his good hand grabbing the mane. Colt tried to mount behind him, but his leg buckled. The wound was worse than a graze. He fell to his knees, the rifle clattering on the rocks. "Go!" he gasped. "Rowan, take him! Get to the line shack, up on Eagle Rim. You know it?" I don't know anything," she cried, the terror breaking through. "You'll find it," Jonas panted. "North, follow the dry gulch, go." "I'm not leaving you," Rowan screamed, trying to pull Colt up. "You are," he said. He grabbed her, his face inches from hers, his eyes blazing in the dark. "Take the horse, take Jonas, get the book. It's in his cabin, under the floorboard by the fire. Get the book, or this is all for nothing. Go." He shoved her toward the horse. An old gelding. She stumbled, grabbing the reins. Her mind was a whirl of terror. Leave him. Leave them both. No. Her fear didn't just turn to resolve. It turned to rage. A cold, hard rage that burned away her panic. She would not be the victim. She would not let them die for her husband's sins. She grabbed the reins of the mare Jonas was on. She grabbed the reins of the gelding. She didn't mount. She started walking, pulling them. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice a low, vicious snarl she didn't recognize. Get up, or so help me God, I will shoot you myself. But we are not dying here." Maybe it was her words. Maybe it was the look in her eyes. But Colt Merritt, his side on fire, looked at her, and a slow, painful smile touched his lips. He grabbed the saddle horn of the gelding and, with a roar of pain, pulled himself up. Rowan didn't wait. She took the reins of both horses and she began to walk, then run, pulling them into the darkness, up the dry gulch, away from the sounds of shouting, and toward the high, cold sanctuary of the hills. They found the line shack 2 hours later, guided by Jonas's half-conscious directions and the high, cold stars. It was a one-room hovel, a tiny, wind-beaten cabin clinging to the side of a rim rock, miles from anything. Just as they reached it, the storm hit. It wasn't just rain. It was a driving, horizontal blast of ice and sand that screamed out of the north. Rowan got them inside. She half-dragged, half-rolled them from their horses, tethering the animals on the leeward side of the shack. She got the door barred, and in the total, suffocating darkness, she fumbled for a match. She found a tin, found a lamp, and with a shaking hand, brought a flame to life. The light revealed a scene from a bad dream. Jonas was unconscious, or close to it, slumped against the wall, his shoulder a mass of sodden, bloody wool. Colt was on his hands and knees, his head down, his body shaking, a dark, spreading stain on his trousers and shirt. The shack was tiny, just a dirt floor, a broken-down cot, and a small, rusted stove. The wind shrieked, rattling the tin roof, and the icy rain hammered against the walls. The world had been reduced to this one, tiny, violent room, and the three of them, alone, in the heart of the storm. Jonas slipped into a fevered sleep. Rowan, her hands still sticky with his blood, turned to Colt. He had managed to pull himself onto the cot, but he was shivering violently, his teeth chattering. The graze was a deep, ragged tear along his ribs, from his back to his side, and it was bleeding. "A lot? Help me," he whispered, his voice thready. "The flask, inside pocket, whiskey." She found it. She unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers fumbling with the cold, wet cloth. She ripped the fabric away, exposing the wound. The skin was blue, the gash ugly and dark. "This is for the wound," he panted, his eyes squeezed shut. "Not for me." She understood. She uncorked the flask and, taking a deep breath, poured the raw whiskey directly into the open cut. Colt screamed. It was a raw, terrible sound, half surrounded by the wind. His entire body arched off the cot, his hands knotted into fists. She did what she had to, finding a clean rag in her pack and pressing it, hard, into the wound. Just as he had made her do for Jonas, he was a hero. No. She looked at his chest, at the old, pale scars that crossed his ribs, a life of violence, of surviving. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who had been close to death, over and over, and had just refused. He lay back, panting, his body slick with sweat. The fever was already taking him. His eyes, when they opened, were unfocused, glassy. He looked at her, but he didn't see her. "Eleanor," he whispered, a broken, desperate sound. "I'm sorry. I should have been there." Rowan's heart clenched. She was just a ghost, a messenger, a stand-in for the woman he had lost. She was about to pull away, to let him have his ghosts. When his eyes suddenly focused, they focused on her. He saw her. He saw the blood on her hands, the grime on her face, the terror in her eyes. His hand, shaking, came up and found her wrist. His grip was weak, but it was there. "Rowan," he said. The name was not a whisper. It was clear. It was a fact. "Don't let them win." He said her name, not Eleanor's, hers. And in that moment, as the storm tried to tear the shack from the side of the mountain, Rowan Pierce understood. She was no longer Silas Pierce's widow. She was no longer just a messenger of guilt. She was the one who was here. She was the one with her hands on the wound. And she was not going to let him die. The wind did not howl. It screamed. It was a high, thin, maniacal sound. The voice of a mad god trying to tear the high plains from the bones of the earth. The line shack, a pathetic little box of wood and tin, shuddered under the assault. Icy rain and sand blasted the walls in horizontal sheets, and the tin roof rattled, each gust threatening to peel it back and expose them to the black, violent sky. But inside, there was a pinprick of defiant warmth. Rowan had found a small, rusted stove in the corner, and a handful of dry kindling tucked in a box beneath it. She had fed it broken pieces of the one chair, and then scraps of wood she'd found boarded over a window. Now, a small, stubborn fire burned in its belly, casting a low, flickering, orange-red glow over the tiny, dirt-floored room. In one corner, Jonas Reed lay still. His breathing was the most important sound in the room, a deep, slow, and even rhythm. Rowan had cleaned his shoulder wound as best she could with the last of the whiskey and strips of fabric torn from her own petticoat. The bullet had gone clean through, a miracle of bad luck and good, and the big man had finally fallen into a deep, healing sleep. His presence, even in slumber, was a heavy, grounding thing. That left the two of them. Colt was propped against the rough plank wall, his legs stretched out toward the stove. Rowan sat a few feet away, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. She had insisted he take the one thin, musty blanket, but he had refused. Instead, it was spread across the small space of floor between them, a shared, threadbare territory. The single lantern, its oil low, sat on the floor, adding its own small circle of yellow light to the stove's red. Colt was awake. The fever from his wound had not broken, but it had receded, leaving him in a state of sharp, painful clarity. The gash in his side throbbed with every beat of his heart, a dull bass drum of pain. He had watched her work, his eyes half closed. He had watched her tend to Jonas, her movements firm and steady, her hands stained with his blood. He had watched her build the fire, her brow furrowed in concentration. Now, in the unsteady light, he looked at her hands. They were resting on her knees, and he could see them clearly. They were small, but they were not the hands of a lady. They were chapped, red, and raw. The skin was broken over her knuckles. New, deep scratches from the horse's reins were layered over older, fainter scars. They were hands that had scrubbed and carried and fought. They were the hands that had pressed down on Jonas's wound, that had poured fire into his own. A strange, unfamiliar feeling rose in his chest. It was gratitude, but it was sharper than that. It was a deep, aching protectiveness that made his own wound seem trivial. She had come here, a messenger of his wife's death, and in less than 2 days, he had dragged her into a gunfight, wounded her friend, and nearly gotten her killed. "I shouldn't have brought you," he said. His voice was a low rasp, rough from his fever and the smoke. Rowan's head snapped up. She had been staring into the stove's small, glowing grate, lost in her own thoughts. "You shouldn't have let me come," she answered, her voice just as low, but clear. "But you didn't have a choice. Neither of us did." She looked away, back to the fire. "When I left Copper Willow," she began, her voice trembling, just slightly, "I thought I knew what I was doing. I was so full of Silas's ghost, his last words. He made me a promise." "Tell him," he said. "Tell Colt Merritt, if you want your soul to rest." I thought he meant his soul. I thought I was just delivering a message, paying a debt. She pulled her hands into her sleeves, as if she were cold. "I came here to find you so I could be done. So I could wash my hands of Silas Pierce and the whole ugly life he'd given me. I thought I could just drop this truth at your feet and walk away. Be free. Lighten my soul," I told myself. She let out a small, bitter laugh. "But then we were at the trail, and at the church, and tonight," she looked down at her own hands, still faintly stained in the dim light. "This isn't about Silas's soul anymore. It's not even about mine." She looked up, and her eyes, the color of dark, clear amber, met his. The fear was gone, replaced by the same grim, exhausted resolve he'd seen in his own men after a long, hopeless skirmish. "Eleanor," she said, her voice soft but fierce. She wrote that question in the book. Who changed the order? She was still fighting. Even when she knew they were coming for her, she was fighting for this whole valley. For justice. Rowan took a shaky breath. I'm not fighting for her. Mr. Merritt, not really. I'm fighting with her. I'm fighting for a chance. A chance to live a different life. A chance to make all the waste mean something." Colt held her gaze. He had seen men confess their sins by firelight, seen them bargain with God as they bled out. He had never seen this. She was not asking for forgiveness. She was declaring her intent. He looked away, at the stove's dull red glow. "For 2 years, he said, his voice hollow. "I've been a ghost. I just didn't have the decency to lie down." He thought of the long, empty nights, the silence of the cabin. "I'd wake up," he said, talking more to the fire than to her. "And I'd get the horses fed, I'd mend the fence, I'd eat, I'd clean my gun, and I'd go to sleep. And every night, I'd put my Colt on the table next to the cot, just waiting. I was waiting for a reason," he admitted, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "For a drifter to get greedy, for a thief, for anyone to come along and give me a reason to pull the trigger, a reason to finally have an enemy I could see, because the enemy I had the grief for was just empty." He turned his head and looked at her. "Then you fell in my barn, you and Eleanor's book. You brought it all back, the pain, the rage. But it's not empty anymore." He nodded toward Jonas. "He's alive. You're alive, and I'm fighting for something more than just hate, more than just an excuse to die." The silence that fell was profound. It was deeper than the storm. The wind howled, the roof rattled. Jonas breathed his steady rhythm, and the stove popped. A small spark landing on the dirt. But between them, the silence was a living thing. Colt watched her. He saw the grime on her cheek, the way the firelight caught the amber in her eyes. He saw the faint, pale crescent moon of a scar, the one just on the edge of her cheekbone, the one he had seen in the cabin, the one that was not from this journey, but from a life before it. Slowly, his movement stiff and pained, he lifted his hand, not his left hand, the one that was closest to her, but his right, his gun hand. He had to use his left to help support his arm, the movement pulling at the wound in his side. He didn't care. He reached across the small space between them. Rowan watched his hand approach. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She just watched. His fingers, calloused and rough, grazed her face. He did not touch her lips or her hair. He laid one finger, gently, on the pale silver line of that old scar. He traced it, a touch so light it was barely there, just the barest whisper of warmth and friction. "You've paid too much," he whispered, his voice thick, "for sins that were never yours to begin with." Rowan's eyes, which had been so strong, so fierce, suddenly filled. A single tear escaped, rolling down her cheek. and he caught it with the pad of his thumb. She did not sob. She did not look away. She just let him see. She leaned her face into his hand, a small, involuntary movement, like a plant seeking the sun. The distance was no longer a few feet. It was the span of his hand. He moved, shifting his weight, the pain in his side a distant, angry signal. He leaned toward her. She leaned toward him. It was not a decision. It was an inevitability. It was two bodies, cold and wounded, drawn to the only other source of warmth in the universe. Their breath mingled. He could smell the cold air on her, the faint, dusty scent of her hair, the metallic tang of fear and blood. His lips touched hers. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound, desperate, and startling recognition. It was slow. It was hesitant. His lips were chapped. Hers were cold. It was a question. "Are you real, am I?" She answered. Her own hand, small and scarred, came up and rested on his chest, not to push him away, but to steady herself, to hold on. She could feel his heart, a strong, steady thump, thump, thump beneath her palm, a counterpoint to the raging storm. The kiss deepened. It was not a rush. It was a slow unfolding. It was the first breath after being underwater for too long. His lips, rough and fever-warm, moved against hers, and she opened to him, a small, quiet sigh escaping her. He tasted the salt of her one tear, the cold of the night, and something else, something that was just her life. His other arm, the one braced on the floor, came up. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull her. He just found her. His hand settled on the side of her neck, his thumb finding the frantic pulse beneath her skin, and he just held her. Her fingers, which had been resting on his chest, moved. They curled, just slightly, gripping the rough, damp fabric of his shirt. A small, anchoring gesture. "I am here. You are here. We are here." When they finally broke apart, they were breathless. They didn't move far, just far enough to see each other's faces in the dim, red light. They were two survivors, two ghosts, who had just proven to each other that they were still, impossibly, alive. Rowan shivered, a delayed reaction to the cold, the fear, the impossible, everything. Colt did not release her. With a pained grunt, he used his one good arm to pull the heavy wool blanket from the floor. He wrapped it around her shoulders. Then he wrapped it around his own, pulling her in. She didn't resist. She sagged against him, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder. He leaned his back against the solid wall, his arm encircling her, pulling her tight against his side, his uninjured side. The blanket trapped their shared warmth. She was small, but she was solid. He could feel the fine tremor that ran through her. He could feel the steady, slowing beat of her heart against his ribs. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in her scent. The storm raged. The wind screamed. The shack shuddered. But inside, it was quiet. They didn't speak for a long time. There were no words for what had just happened. "Eleanor," Rowan whispered into his shirt. The name a small, pained sound. "Shh," he said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "It's all right." He didn't know what he meant, but he knew it was the truth. They sat there, huddled together in the dark. The night was not about passion. It was not about the taking of comfort. It was about the giving of it. It was about the simple, profound, and revolutionary act of two people, broken by the world, choosing not to be alone. They whispered, in the long, dark hours, as the stove burned low and the wind finally began to tire. They whispered. She told him about Silas, not the monster, but the weak, charming man who had promised her a new life and given her a cage. He told her about Eleanor, not the saint, but the stubborn, laughing woman who had taught him how to plant a garden and how to fight for what was his. They talked about mistakes. They talked about fear. They talked about the cold, nagging guilt of being the ones left standing. And as the first faint, gray light of a new, uncertain dawn began to seep through the cracks in the wall, They talked about the ledger. They talked about Pike. And they talked, for the first time, about what they were going to do tomorrow. Rowan, her voice muffled against his chest, said, I don't just want to avenge her. Colt, I want to build something. Like she was... Colt tightened his grip, his hand finding hers under the blanket. He held it. He didn't say anything. He just held it. And for the first time in 2 years, as the storm finally broke, he wasn't waiting for a reason to die. He was holding onto a reason to live. The dawn broke sharp and clear, the storm having scrubbed the sky to a high, brittle blue. The world was remade, pristine and cold, the snow-covered plains glittering under a mercilessly bright sun. They had made it back from the line shack by some miracle of Jonas's grim determination and Rowan's newfound, iron-willed resolve. Jonas was slumped in his saddle, his shoulder wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, barely conscious but alive. Colt's side was a fire of raw pain, the wound stiff and angry, but the fever had broken with the storm. Rowan had ridden between them, not as a passenger, but as a guard. She had retrieved the ledger from Jonas's cabin, the floorboard already loosened, just as he'd said. The book was now tucked securely inside her coat, a heavy, righteous weight against her ribs. They were a broken, battered trio, 2 wounded men and a woman who had been a ghost. But as they rode over the rise and saw sagebrush crossing below, they were no longer victims. They were an army. Bartholomew Pike had chosen his day well. The sun was high. The air was still. It was a perfect day for a funeral, or a land auction, which in Pike's hands were often the same thing. He had set up his stage on the newly built wooden platform in front of his bank, the very heart of the town. New railroad flags, red and white, snapped crisply in the cold air. A crowd had gathered. It was a town divided. On one side, Pike's men, a dozen or more, lounged near the platform, their coats unbuttoned, their hands near their guns. They were a mix of saloon toughs and hard-eyed strangers, all wearing the same look of paid arrogance. On the other side stood the ranchers, the ones who had been bled dry, the ones who were there to watch the last nail be driven into their coffins. They were a grim, silent cluster of faded coats and worn-out hats. In the middle were the town's good folk, the shopkeepers and the preacher, their face carefully neutral, ready to applaud the winner, whoever it was. Pike stood on the platform, a vision of prosperity in his tailored black coat and silver vest. He was flanked by the nervous, bird-like preacher and by Deputy Macklin Dorsey. Dorsey's face was pale, his eyes darting from the crowd to Pike and back, his hand resting on his pistol, not in readiness, but like a man holding a hot coal. "Friends, citizens of Sagebrush," Pike's voice boomed, a rich, confident baritone that rolled across the square. "Today, we do not just sell land. We build a future, we lay the steel foundation of prosperity, a new era of commerce and civilization, brought to you by fraud." The voice was not loud. It was low, cold, and it cut through Pike's speech like a razor. A path parted in the crowd. Colt Merritt stepped through. He was a terrible sight. His face was gaunt, his beard matted, his shirt stained with his own dried blood. He walked with a stiff, painful gait, his hand pressed against his side, but his eyes, locked on Pike, were clear and burning. He was not alone. To his right, Jonas Reed, his large frame leaning heavily on a piece of cottonwood branch as a crutch, his arm in a crude sling, limped forward. His face was a mask of dark, resolute pain. To his left, Rowan Pierce, her face streaked with grime, her hair tucked under a man's hat, walked with him. She was carrying Colt's rifle, holding it at her side, muzzle down. Pike's smile froze. The blood drained from his face. His eyes went from Colt to Jonas, to the woman, and he knew, "This is a public auction. Merritt," Pike snarled, his composure cracking. "Not a shelter for the lost. It's a crime scene," Colt said, his voice carrying in the sudden, dead silence. He stopped 20 paces from the platform. He looked past Pike, his eyes finding Macklin Dorsey. "Deputy," Colt called out, "you're a man of the law. You took an oath." Rowan stepped forward. She unbuttoned her coat and pulled out the ledger. She held it up. "Eleanor Merritt's book," Colt said, his voice shaking, not with weakness, but with rage. "Her last words, her proof." Rowan walked forward, alone. She did not look at Pike's men, who tensed, their hands moving to their guns. She walked past them, her gaze fixed on the deputy. She climbed the 2 steps to the platform and stood in front of Macklin Dorsey. She held the book out to him. She was a brave woman, Rowan said, her voice small but carrying. "Are you a brave man, deputy?" The entire town watched. This was the moment. Dorsey looked at the book. He looked at Rowan's steady, amber eyes. He looked at Pike, whose face was now a mask of purple rage. His hand raised in a silent, furious command to stop. Dorsey looked at Jonas, a fellow soldier, battered but not broken. He looked at Colt, a man who had clearly walked through hell to get here, and he made his choice. His hand, shaking, left his gun. He took the book. "What is this?" Pike hissed, grabbing for it. "It's evidence, Mr. Pike," Dorsey said, his voice surprisingly firm. He stepped away from Pike, to the center of the platform, and he opened the ledger. "Read it," a voice from the crowd shouted. It was Old Man Hemmings, the rancher who had lost his bull. "Read it, boy." Dorsey found the page, the last page, the one they had shown him in the pre-dawn light when they'd returned. He cleared his throat. "Entry October 14, 1874, Dorsey began, his voice gaining strength. "Pike, $500 to Silas Pierce and Frank Hamer. Deputy Sims, $100 to find drifters and close the case." A roar of shock went up from the crowd. Deputy Sims was Dorsey's predecessor, a man who had retired rich. "He's lying," Pike shouted, his face ashen. "It's a forgery, the ravings of a madwoman." "Keep reading," Colt roared. "Entry, October 16th, Dorsey read, his voice now ringing. "Copper Willow Basin ambush. Order warning shot. Frighten. Do not kill." He paused, his own voice thick. A final note. Frank Hamer seen with new money, talking to a third party. The order was to scare. Who changed the order? The crowd was no longer a collection of individuals. It was a single, angry beast. Men who had been forced to sell. Men who had been threatened. Men who had been poisoned. All saw the truth. "It's a lie," Pike screamed, his mask of civilization gone, revealing the rabid animal beneath. One of Pike's most loyal men, a big man with a drover's mustache, finally acted. He had been waiting for the signal. He drew his pistol, a fast, smooth motion, and aimed it. Not at the deputy, but at the man who had started it all. He aimed it at Colt. "Colt!" Rowan screamed. But Jonas, wounded as he was, had been waiting. He was a soldier. He knew you watched the hands. As the man drew, Jonas lunged forward, his good shoulder slamming into the man's arm. Crack the gun fired, the bullet going wild, ripping through a railroad flag, shattering the bank's front window. It was the only shot needed. The square exploded. It was not a Wild West duel. It was a brawl, a riot. The dozen paid guns, suddenly finding themselves surrounded by 24 enraged, desperate ranchers, faltered. A few fired into the crowd. The ranchers, some armed only with fists and fury, others with pistols they'd carried for years, surged forward. Gunsmoke filled the square, a sulphurous, gray fog. Men were shouting, cursing, screaming. Colt did not move. He did not draw. His eyes had never left Pike. Through the roiling smoke, he saw Pike jump from the platform, not to join the fight, but to flee. He was running for the alley by the bank, for the horse he always had tethered there. Colt moved to intercept him. He was wounded, but he was faster. He stepped in front of the alley, blocking the man's path. The two men stood, 4 feet apart, in a small, sudden island of quiet in the middle of the chaos. "You!" Pike hissed, his fine suit spattered with mud, his eyes wild with terror and hate. You were dead. She was dead. She should have just stayed quiet." "She did," Colt said, his voice a low, terrible promise. Now it's my turn to talk. Colt's hand was on his gun, but he didn't draw. This was the moment, the one he had craved for 2 years, the moment he could pull the trigger, could send this man to the hell he deserved. He could feel the rage, the black, satisfying pull of vengeance. Pike saw the hesitation. He saw the man, not just the killer, and he was a cornered rat. He lunged. He didn't pull a gun. From a sheath hidden in his fine coat, he pulled a long, thin, Arkansas-style dagger. He roared, a desperate, inhuman sound, and lunged forward, the blade aimed low, at Colt's belly. Eleanor deserved it, he screamed. Colt reacted, but he was slow. The wound, the hesitation. He grabbed Pike's wrist, the blade stopping an inch from his stomach. The two men locked together, straining. Pike was strong, wiry, and fueled by a rat's panic. Colt was stronger, but he was wounded, and he was torn. His gun was in its holster. His hand was on the man's wrist. He could kill him. He could break his neck, but he was frozen. Vengeance or justice. To kill him was to become him. To let him live was to let Eleanor's murder go unanswered. Pike twisted the knife, the blade slicing through Colt's coat, drawing new blood. Crack! It was a single shot. Not the heavy boom of Colt's Navy. It was the sharper, faster crack of a rifle. Pike screamed, a high, thin shriek. His eyes went wide. The knife clattered to the muddy street. Colt looked down. Pike's right hand, the one that had held the knife, was a ruin of blood and shattered bone. He looked up, across the square, standing on the steps of the platform. Rowan stood, unmoving. She was holding the rifle, the barrel still pointed, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the muzzle. She had not shot to kill. She had not shot for revenge. She had shot to save. She had shot for justice. She had answered Eleanor's question. Pike collapsed, clutching his ruined hand, sobbing in the mud. No longer a tycoon, just a man in pain. The gunfight faltered, the sound of that single, precise rifle shot cutting through the chaos. The ranchers, seeing their leader broken, surged. Pike's paid men, their boss now a screaming mess on the ground, lost their nerve. They threw down their guns. They ran. The silence that fell was as loud as the gunfire. Deputy Macklin Dorsey, his face pale but his eyes hard, walked over. He looked at Pike, then at Colt. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Bartholomew Pike," Dorsey said, his voice ringing in the sudden quiet. "You are under arrest, for fraud, for conspiracy, and for the murder of Eleanor Merritt." He hauled Pike to his feet and, ignoring the man's sobs, bound his one good hand. The townspeople, the ones who had been silent, gathered around, their faces a mixture of awe and shame and a new, hard respect. Colt Merritt stood, his side on fire, his body screaming, but his mind perfectly, terribly clear. He watched them drag Pike away. He had not gotten his vengeance. He had gotten something better. He felt a movement at his side. He turned. Rowan was there. She had left the rifle. Her face was pale, her hands trembling so hard she had to clench them into fists. But her eyes were steady. He looked at her. She looked at him. No words were spoken. In the middle of the smoky, ruined square, surrounded by the wreckage of one man's greed and the birth of another's redemption, Colt's hand found hers. Her fingers, small and scarred, slid between his, gripping him with a desperate, familiar strength. They just stood, and for the first time they watched the smoke clear, together. It was 3 weeks before the letter came. It arrived from Cheyenne with the circuit judge, a folded piece of official paper that felt heavier than a brick. Colt, his side now a long, puckered scar, took it from the post rider with a steady hand. He, Jonas, and Rowan read it together, standing on the porch of the cabin, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Bartholomew Pike was convicted, guilty on all counts: fraud, bribery, conspiracy to commit violence, and accessory to the murder of Eleanor Merritt. Frank Hamer, the man who had pulled the trigger, had been killed in a bar fight in a town 2 territories over, a fittingly squalid end. But Pike, The man who had given the order, the man who had changed the order, was bound for the territorial prison, his name and his railroad now a monument to his own greed. The letter was clear. The court had entered Eleanor's ledger into the official record. Her name was not just a passing mention. It was cited as the primary reason for the investigation. The unimpeachable testimony of a citizen who died in defense of the truth. The words that had once been whispered in saloons, "Stubborn woman," died for nothing, were gone. She was a hero. Her name carved into the law, permanent and clean. That evening, Colt saddled Hades. He did it alone. He said nothing to Rowan or Jonas, but they knew. They watched him ride out, not west toward the pass, but north, toward the high bluffs. He rode to Cedar Bluff, a high, wind-swept ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The view from here was vast, the sky a deep, aching blue that went on forever. There, under a lone, twisted cedar, was the simple wooden marker he had carved 2 years ago. Eleanor Merritt, a good wife. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in the immense silence. The only other sound was the high, thin whistle of the wind through the cedar branches. He stood before the grave for a long time, the letter from Cheyenne in his hand. He knelt, his knee cracking in the cold, thin air, and placed the letter on the mound of stones at the base of the marker, weighing it down with a new, white quartz rock. "Well, Elle," he said, his voice a low, rough sound that the wind stole immediately. "You did it. You beat him." He told her everything. He spoke aloud, to the wind and the stones. He told her about the barn, about the woman whispering her name. He told her about the ledger in the bell tower, about the fear and the fight. He told her about Jonas and about Rowan. He held nothing back. He sat there as the sun began to dip, painting the western sky in strokes of violent orange and deep, bruised purple. He thought he would feel a great final wave of grief. He thought it would break him. One last time. But it didn't. He thought of her laugh, the way she'd thrown her head back. He thought of the time she'd dropped a full pie on the floor and had, after a moment of stunned silence, sat on the floor and simply eaten it from the tin. A small smile, a painful, rusty thing, touched his lips. He was still in love with her. He knew, in that moment, that he would be in love with her for the rest of his life. But the love, which for 2 years had been a wild forest fire, a thing of black rage and choking smoke that consumed everything, had finally burned itself out. What was left was not ash. It was a bed of deep, glowing embers, a warmth he could carry with him, a light to see by, not a fire to be consumed by. He could cry, he realized, and not feel weak. He could smile and not feel like a traitor. He touched the wooden marker. "I miss you," he whispered. "God, I miss you." He stayed until the first stars appeared, cold and sharp in the twilight. Then he stood, his joints stiff, and mounted his horse. He rode back, not as a widower, but as a man. He had been gone 2 days. While he was gone, life had moved on. Jonas, his arm now healing properly in a clean sling, had found his soldier's impatience returning. He was bored. Rowan, with no one to tend but a grumpy invalid, had found a new purpose. She had been cleaning the cabin, truly cleaning it for the first time. The layers of Colt's grief-filled neglect were thick, in a small, dust-covered chest under the cot. She had found Eleanor's things. Not her clothes, those were gone, but her life, a tin box of seeds, a small, leather-bound book of poetry, and a large wooden slate, along with a tin box half full of precious chalk nubs. The next day, Rowan had ridden to the neighboring Hemmings ranch, the one that had been saved by the ledger. She had returned with 2 children in tow, a boy of 10 and a girl of 8, both shy and wild-eyed. When Colt rode over the final rise, he reined Hades to a stop. He saw them. The porch, which had been his silent, lonely perch for 2 years, was alive. Jonas was sitting in the one good chair, his feet up, whittling a piece of wood. And Rowan was sitting on the top step, the dark-haired Hemmings girl at her knee. She had the slate in her lap, She was laughing, her head thrown back, the sound a clear, bright bell that carried across the yard. The boy was drawing in the dirt with a stick. She was teaching them their letters. Colt watched, his hand tight on the reins. A war was raging in his chest. A conflict so sharp it took his breath away. Guilt. It was a cold, sick feeling. That was Eleanor's slate. That was Eleanor's porch. Those should have been Eleanor's children. He felt a sharp, visceral sense of betrayal, as if he had just been caught committing a terrible crime. He was replacing her. He was letting this woman, this stranger, sit in his wife's place, and he was letting it happen. And then, desire, a feeling just as strong, just as sharp, but a hot, living thing. Because Rowan turned her head, sensing him. She saw him. She smiled. It was not Eleanor's smile. It was not a ghost's smile. It was her own. It was tired, and it was marked by her own scars. But it was bright, and it was real, and it was aimed at him. He wasn't looking at a replacement. He was looking at Rowan, strong and weak and real and alive, and he wanted, with a deep, aching hunger that had nothing to do with lust and everything to do with life, to ride up to that porch, dismount, and sit beside her. He rode forward. That night, the tension was back. Jonas, sensing the air, had declared his shoulder was fit for a man's work and had taken a bedroll to the barn, an act of gruff, military tact. Colt and Rowan were alone in the cabin. The fire was lit. The silence was thick, charged with the unspoken words of his return. Colt stood by the fireplace, one arm braced on the mantel. He was staring into the flames. Rowan sat at the table, her hands clasped. "She looks happy," Colt said, his voice quiet. "The Hemming girl. She's smart," Rowan said, her voice just as small. "They just needed a chance. The slate. I hope it was all right." "It was," he said. He turned from the fire. His face was a map of shadows, his eyes tortured. "Rowan, when I saw you, on the porch." He stopped. He couldn't say it. "I know," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "You feel like you're forgetting her." He shook his head, a violent, pained motion. "No, worse. I feel like I'm burying her again. Like this new feeling, this thing I feel for you is a betrayal. It's ink, poured over her name, and it scares me." He had said it, the terrible, ugly truth. He stood there, exposed, his chest aching more than his wound. Rowan was silent for a long moment. Then she stood. She walked to him, stopping just in front of him. So close she had to tilt her head back to see his face. The firelight was warm on her skin. She did not touch his face. She did not try to kiss him. She laid her small, scarred hand flat on his chest, directly over his heart. He flinched, as if her hand were hot. She kept it there. She could feel the slow, steady, powerful beat of his life. Thump, 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 solid as the earth. "A man's heart," she said, her voice low and steady, her amber eyes holding his. "Isn't a small thing. Colt, it isn't a single piece of paper where one name has to be crossed out to write another." She pressed her hand, just slightly, as if to make him feel his own pulse. "It has room," she whispered. "It has room for all of it. It has room for the pain and the joy. It has room for the ghost and the living. You don't have to use one to kill the other." She looked up at him, her gaze so honest it hurt. "You can love her. You can miss her. You can keep that ember warm for the rest of your life. It doesn't mean you don't have room for this." He looked down at her, at the woman who had walked out of a storm, who had faced down his rage, who had put her hands in Jonas's blood, who had fired a rifle to save his life. He saw the strength that was not hard, but resilient. He saw the life, waiting to be lived. His hands, which had been clenched at his sides, slowly came up. They settled on her waist. He didn't pull her closer. He just held her. He was anchoring himself. The next morning, the spell was broken by a different kind of honesty. The three of them were at the table. Rowan was pouring coffee. Colt passed the bacon to Jonas. It was quiet, domestic, and charged. Colt had found himself staring at the way the morning light caught in Rowan's hair. She had looked up, caught him, and her cheeks had flushed, but she hadn't looked away. Jonas cleared his throat, a sound like gravel in a bucket. They both looked at him. He was squinting at them over the rim of his coffee mug, his face a perfect, deadpan mask of military disapproval. "Respectfully, Mr. Merritt, ma'am," he rumbled, his voice dry as dust. "If you two are going to continue to gaze at each other like that, over the flapjacks, I'm going to have to find new lodgings. A man's constitution can only take so much." Colt, who had not laughed in 2 years, barked, a short, rusty, surprised sound. Rowan's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes crinkling, a real, unrestrained giggle escaping her. The tension shattered, like a pane of glass, and the small cabin was suddenly filled with the sound of it. That afternoon, Colt didn't go to the barn to be alone. He went to the woodpile, and he began to chop, and after, he didn't just mend the broken corral fence. He tore the old, rotten section down, and he began to build a new one, the sharp, clean sound of his hammer ringing out in the clear, cold air. He wasn't just mending, he was building. A few days later, Rowan found the tin of seeds. She took the small spade from the shed and began to turn the earth, not in the old, dead garden plot, but along the new fence Colt was building. She planted the lupine and the columbine and the paintbrush, the same flowers Eleanor had loved, but she planted them in her own way, in a wild, new, and beautiful line. That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, Colt spoke. "Eleanor always said," he began, and neither of them flinched at the name. "She always said that the spring water here was the sweetest in the territory." Rowan leaned her head, just slightly, so her shoulder rested against his. "She was right," she said. The name was spoken. It was not a shadow. It was not a ghost. It was a memory shared between them. It was a light. Spring came to the High Valley not as a gentle guest, but as a conquering army. It swept up from the lowlands, a relentless wave of green that broke against the high peaks. The snows of the long winter melted, swelling Willow Ford Creek until it ran fast and clear, washing away the last of the mud and the memory of the long, dark season. The young willow branches, which had been bare, skeletal claws, were suddenly covered in a soft, pale green fuzz. The air, which for so long had tasted only of ice and stone, now smelled of damp earth, new grass, and the promise of life. It was as if the land itself, having borne witness to so much deceit, was finally being scrubbed clean. One afternoon, when the sun was high and the air was warm enough to feel on the skin, Colt took Rowan's hand. He didn't say where they were going. He just led her, his hand warm and solid around hers, and they walked, not to the high bluff, but down toward the water. They followed the creek until they came to the bend, the place where Eleanor had stood her ground, the place she had been willing to die for. The water here was loud, chuckling and rushing over the smooth, clean stones. The sun, slanting through the new leaves of the cottonwoods, dappled the water in patterns of gold and shadow. They stood on the bank, the sound of the water filling the silence between them. This was the heart of it all. The water. The reason. Colt reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a ring, not a cold band of metal. He pulled out a thin, supple, leather thong, the kind he used for mending bridles. It was strong, and it was worn smooth with work. He took her left hand, her scarred, capable hand, and he looked at her. His steel-gray eyes, which had held so much cold and so much rage, were now clear and deep and filled with a quiet, profound light. I don't have a preacher," he said, his voice a low, rough sound, barely audible over the creek. "And I don't have a church. We just have this." He gestured to the water, the sky, the land. "I made a promise here once." "Rowan," he said, his voice thick. "I stood right here, with Eleanor, and I promised her I would fight to keep this water free, that it would never belong to one man, but to everyone who needed it." He looked down at their hands. He began to wrap the leather thong, slowly, around her wrist. "Now I'm making a promise to you," he whispered. His eyes locked on hers. "I'm going to keep my heart just as free, free to love you fully, with all that I am." not by betraying her, not by forgetting her, but by loving you. Rowan. He tied a simple, strong knot, the leather dark against her skin. It was not a shackle. It was a bond. Rowan was crying, but she was smiling. The tears were bright, clean things, catching the sunlight. She reached into her own pocket. She pulled out a simple, rough-spun thread of bright red wool, the color of a cardinal's wing, the color of blood, and fire, and life. She took his hand, his large, calloused, gun hand, the hand that had held hers in the dark, the hand that had fought for her. "I'm not here to replace her, Colt," she said, her voice shaking but as strong as the running water. "I could never, and I wouldn't want to. I'm here to stand with her, with you, to finish the story, the one she started." She wrapped the red thread around his wrist, a bright, startling circle of color against his sun-darkened skin. "She wanted this place to be safe," Rowan whispered, tying her own knot. "She wanted this to be a home for people who had lost. So do I, with you." He didn't say anything. He just raised her hand, the one bound in leather, and he kissed her knuckles. Then he put his arm around her, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, and they stood for a long time, just listening to the sound of the water. A promise kept. When they returned to the ranch, they did not ride in silence. They rode side by side, their knees brushing, and when they crested the last rise, they saw it. Jonas was on the porch, a whittling knife in his good hand, pretending not to be watching, but he was, and he had not been idle. Hanging from the main gate, where the old, faded merit sign had once hung, was a new, cleanly carved piece of pine. The letters were burned deep and clear into the wood. Merit Pierce Springs for travelers, widows, and wanderers. Colt reined his horse to a stop, his throat suddenly tight. Rowan rode up beside him, and her hand found his. It was a home. It had a name. The ranch was no longer a place of hiding. It was a sanctuary. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm, the rhythm of building. The mornings were filled with sounds. From the porch, where Rowan sat with the slate, came the sound of life. The Hemmings children, who were now permanent fixtures, were there, but so were two of the other ranchers' wives, and one of the young men who worked for Hemmings. They were all learning. The hesitant, halting sound of a woman in her 40s sounding out a word, followed by Rowan's gentle, encouraging murmur, the sound of laughter, clear and easy, as the Hemmings boy made a joke. From the barn, a new sound, a sound of industry. Colt had built a forge. He was shoeing his own horses, but he was also mending the rancher's tools, the ones that had been broken for a season. The rhythmic, ringing clang-clang-clang of his hammer on the anvil was a kind of music. It was the sound of a man making things whole again. One late afternoon, they walked, all three of them. Jonas, his arm now mostly healed, his gait still favoring his wound, walked beside them. They climbed the high ridge to Cedar Bluff. The wind was still there, a high, lonely song. The wooden marker was solid, the letter from Cheyenne now gone, taken by the wind, its message delivered. They had brought a basket. Rowan knelt, and from the basket, she took a large bunch of wildflowers, the ones she had been tending by the new fence, bright blue lupine, and splashes of red paintbrush. She laid them on the grave. Colt stood beside her. He looked at the marker. A good wife. Rowan reached out and took his hand. He laced his fingers through hers. Jonas stepped up beside them, his old cavalry hat in his hand, held over his chest. They didn't speak. They weren't asking Eleanor for permission. They weren't asking for her blessing. They were reporting. They were thanking her. They were a broken soldier, a grieving husband, and a guilty widow. A strange, impossible, and unbreakable family, standing on a windy hill, thanking the woman whose courage and whose sacrifice had forged them into one. That night, the stars were so bright they looked like holes punched in a black, velvet sky. The air was cool, but not cold. Colt and Rowan sat on the porch step, shoulder to shoulder. The warmth of his leg pressing against hers, the silence was no longer empty. It was full. It was full of the day's work, of the children's laughter, of the sound of Jonas in the barn, telling a story to the horses. Rowan leaned her head against his shoulder. He let out a long, slow breath and leaned his own head against hers. His arm, which had felt so empty for so long, came up and settled around her. It felt right. It felt as right as the hammer in his hand. "If a man can be changed," he whispered, his voice a low rumble against her hair. "If he can be reforged like iron in the fire, then I want this." He held her, just a little tighter. "I want the rest of my life with you, to be the proof that from all that hate, from all that revenge, you can build justice. From all that guilt you can make hope, and that from two broken, widowed people you can build a new family." It began with a man finding a half-frozen widow, sleeping in the straw beside his horse. It began with him hearing her whisper his dead wife's name, and it ended here, with him realizing that sometimes the greatest act of defiance, the coldest, sharpest, and sweetest revenge against a world that tried to bury you, is to choose to live, to choose to forgive, and to choose, impossibly, to love again. Thank you for listening to this story. If this tale of justice, second chances, and souls reforged in the frontier fire touched your heart, please let us know. Comment below and tell us what state or what country you're listening from, so we can all share in the journey. Subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and hit that hype button to help more people hear this story and keep these tales alive on the rails of time.